Hello YouTube and hello conference report. So I took down some notes on your video, and you touched on a wide breadth of points in there. And there was one thing that you said that I found kind of interesting. First of all, and you said whether they be knowledge hierarchies or power hierarchies. And this triggered Foucault in my head. So immediately I'm watching the video with Foucault in the background in my mind. I'm not sure that there is. Well, I would say that distinction is something that's actually introduced with the internet. The difference between knowledge hierarchies and power hierarchies. You can have people who who are still competent to talk about various subjects and such, and can still gain notoriety and all of this. And people have such access to information that they never had before, that all of a sudden this, what I would say, the notion of a knowledge hierarchy is something that is kind of building itself as distinct from a power hierarchy. Traditionally, or in a pre-digital world, it was almost impossible. And this is one of Foucault's central problems: is how do we uncouple knowledge from power? And I sort of agree that, like, wherever you find knowledge, you find power. Wherever you find power, you will also find knowledge. Right? I agree that there's this coupling, and this is what becomes really socially, I think, radical about the internet, is that it splits that in half. Not entirely, of course, but it has the potential to split that in half. It has this potential to divorce what you call knowledge hierarchies from power hierarchies. And I think that has effects that we haven't even really begun to see yet. Then you talk about there are good hierarchies, right? And this is where my anarchism sort of kicks in. The distinction between bad hierarchies and good hierarchies is I think that's a real distinction, right? I think that we are more or less a hierarchical species, right? And I don't think that there is such a thing as a world without hierarchies. That's almost a contradiction in terms. And I think the good anarchist position on this topic would be something like if you have a teacher and classroom environment, there's an asymmetrical relationship there, but that makes sense because you have somebody who is learned, right? You have somebody who knows more than the other people. So there's a natural asymmetry. There's an organic asymmetry, which is something very different than a reified formal hierarchy, where, like, for instance, like the President of the United States as an office is thought through as existing independent of the person who occupies that office, right? So you have this distinction between organically cropping up hierarchies, which are just a necessary feature of reality, and to sort of freeze those, and to evacuate them of content, and to just sort of plug different people in. So the hierarchy remains, even though, regardless of whether or not somebody deserves or somebody has the credentials to occupy them. And those are the kinds of situations where I think that hierarchy becomes a becomes a real problem, or have the tendency to become a real problem. And I would say, and then I would say that tendency makes those kinds of hierarchies in themselves a real problem, right? So it's the issue of good hierarchies, and that's obviously like way simplified for the purpose of a YouTube video, but then you get on to the point of a privately owned public square, and you say this is what YouTube is and such, and I think that's true, kind of. I think, well, obviously it's true, right? But I feel dubious about it. I'm still resistant to the idea that private property can function in the same way that that it does in the real world, right? So I think that there's that with the internet, and this is something we haven't quite seen yet. And well, we have seen it in conversations around piracy, but I think that the notion of property is something that is going to have to be radically revised in the coming years, especially when you get on the subject of things like 3D printing, and you know, you could theoretically pirate all sorts of physical objects and stuff. Property is when people start applying the notion of privately owned to the internet, I start to get a little bit wary, because I feel like the notion of private ownership is sort of propped up on a house of cards on the internet, and I think it's something that is kind of mutually with the technology, particularly as you know, P2P you know, technologies grow, right? The internet is very much a space of the commons, and so I think we have to start thinking in a way that isn't predicated on classical notions of property in order to actually get a grasp of these things, right? So there's a curious sort of dialectic at work there. Then I want to hop back to Foucault for a second. You talk about all of the formal things that the medium has introduced, things like a like button and dislike button and all of this, right? All of these sort of formal dimensions that structure or that have structural effects on the internal reality of the internet, right? And this again makes me think of Foucault, and you could almost suggest, you know, Foucault talks about biopolitics, and he talks about it in terms of a proliferation of what he calls a microphysics of power. So you don't have a king who's the source of power, but you have power relationships that are distributed amongst people, and they're not necessarily better, which is kind of his point. And I think that this is central to what you're talking about. The notion of we have a populace who has the capacity to like and dislike things and all of that, and then that structures the content. This is a digital microphysics of power, for me. This is or I don't want to say it necessarily is, but I think it has kind of manifested itself in a certain way, right? And even just at points where, like, you know, I try not to ramble too badly in my videos because people are less likely to watch them, right? Like that kind of relationship. And I fail at doing that too. And then you get onto this point, which is the most fascinating point, the issue of identity in the internet. And I think that it's I think that this is something that's perhaps impossible to actually articulate. First of all, though, there is one big shift, which is this might be a confusing bit of language, but identity at one point I would say is something was something analog. It was something that we produced in real time, kind of. Whereas the internet has introduced a different kind of or a different way of shaping identity, and it's digital, not just in the sense that it occupies a digital medium, but it's digital in the sense that it occurs in discrete units, right? So like a tweet followed by another tweet followed by another tweet, right? Or like a YouTube video or something like this. So you have these like blocks that you can sort of stitch together and call that an identity. And you talk about doing that, but and you make a lot of these statements about how, the mechanisms of nomadicism within the internet and all this stuff. I feel like we're not at a point where we can actually begin to develop an understanding of how the internet affects identity. And I think that there's it has to do with it's a generational thing, right? Like, I feel like, I'm 26 years old, about to be 27. I feel like my generation occupies a really curious hinge point in history where, like, I walked around, went outside of my house with a bunch of quarters in my pocket so I could use a payphone. Or, like, hey, I'll meet you here at this time, and if you're not there, I'm screwed, right? Like, there's no cell phones to mediate that. I still remember all of that, but at the same time I had a computer in my classroom in 4th grade or something. And I got my first connection to the internet maybe when I was in 6th or 7th grade. But, so I occupy a curious hinge point, I feel, at least. But I think everybody might think of their own generation in that way. What I'm curious about is, or I don't think that we can formulate a concept of identity in the internet until the kids who are maybe in elementary school right now, right? The kids who, used to make fun of parents for giving their kids cell phones at the age of like 6 or something, right? That's becoming normative. And I think that as these digital tools begin to shape people in their formative years, and as they grow up, that's when I think we'll begin to be able to understand what effects the internet has on identity. Especially because there's the emotional attachment that I have to my friends who I see physically, right, is perhaps I've made some very good friends via YouTube and the internet and such, but it's a different it's obviously very different than the people who I've known since 5th grade or something. It's a very different kind of way of interacting and way of talking and dealing with people and presenting myself to people. And it's a very different canvas upon which to paint my identity, right? And I think that as that difference sort of works its way into children, basically, and as they grow up, I feel like we're going to see a radical break in how people conceive of themselves at a basic psychological level. And I don't know if that's going to be something that's radically fractured or something like that. But at the same time, I'm really hesitant. This is what makes me really hesitant to I don't want to say that's better or worse. I'll put it that way, because in order to say that's a good or bad thing, I have to impose normative judgments on on a space where they don't apply, right? I have to use language that emerges from a certain conception of identity to praise or attack, if you like, uh, a completely different, what I think at least is going to be a completely different conception of personhood. And I feel like there's something dominating in that, right? This is perhaps more of my anarchism coming out. There's something unfairly asymmetrical about that. And this is how I feel when, in that conversation between the skeptical heretic and the true puka and P.Z. Myers and all them, they got on talking about associating your driver's license ID number with like a Gmail account or something like that. And this sounds very much like the old guard trying to impose itself on the young. It doesn't sound like it sounds like someone from the outside trying to structure something from the inside. And I don't think that we appreciate nearly enough that not even I, I guess I'm a pretty young guy, and you who seem a bit older, we're not justified in making broad normative statements for their world that they're going to inhabit. So there's an ethical problem in there too. So yeah, those are just my thoughts on your video, and this video is getting a little long, so I'm going to cut it. But have a good day.